Доброго вечора, українські радіаційні онкологи, медичні фізики, слава Україні. Дуже дякуємо, що приєдналися до Research Methodology Course for Ukraine. Help Ukraine Group, Astra International Research and Development Committee are excited to present the last lecture in the course. This is the lecture number 12, and as you can see, it will be on grant writing and research funding strategies. But before we start the introduction to the lecture, I would like to make an announcement, even though we'll have the last lecture in this course today. We will continue to support Ukraine with research projects, funding, and mentorship. We are still waiting for the Swedish Cancer Society to transfer the funding for the top 5 projects you proposed, and we hope to receive and distribute the funding soon. In addition, we applied for more funding, $20,000 to support more projects, and we have received preliminary approval for this, so we're quite excited. And we are waiting for the final confirmation from Swecare and Swedish government to support your project ideas. We'll be reaching out to you if you're still interested in conducting the project you previously proposed, or you would like to make some changes to your proposal, maybe based on today's lecture, you will. In addition to this, we would like to organize a session in the fall to report on research projects being conducted in Ukraine. And these will be the reports from the top 5 research teams that are conducting the projects. In between now and the fall, we can also organize webinars for you if you need support in certain aspects, for example, trial writing or manuscript writing. After this lecture, we will be sending out the post-course exam with evaluation where you can suggest the topics for these webinars, what support you would need. So please complete the exam and evaluation. It's required for your BABAR credits. So coming back to today's lecture, our topic today is grant writing and research funding strategies, and our amazing speaker is Dr. Arta Monjazeb. Dr. Monjazeb is a professor of radiation oncology, director of radiation biology at the UC Davis Comprehensive Cancer Center. He is a clinician scientist leading the clinical care of patients and R01 funded basic science research lab in innovative human clinical trials. Dr. Monjazeb served in leadership multiple roles on institutional and national level, including PI on R01 funded basic science research lab, heading GI and sarcoma radiotherapy at UC Davis. He's also director of cancer immunology and energetics program at UC Davis Comprehensive Cancer Center, director of radiobiology for the UC Davis Department of Radiation Oncology, and in addition, NRG Oncology Immunotherapy Committee co-chair. He served on numerous NIH standing and special emphasis panel study sections, and he's a PI of institutional investigator-initiated trials and national clinical trials. So quite an amazing resume, and we are really lucky to have you here as a speaker. We're very honored to have you with us today, and thank you for making the time in your busy schedule to give this lecture. We are eager to learn from you, and we are really excited about this topic of scientific writing and research funding. The podium is yours, so I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and yeah, I'm very excited to be here and share the insights that I have. I've been fortunate in my career in terms of being able to successfully get grants for research. Admittedly, being in the United States, my grants are mainly through NIH and United States Foundation, so I'm not nearly as experienced with obtaining funding through European agencies. But having said that, I have reviewed for several European grant agencies, including Switzerland and Ireland and a few other countries. And the process and what they're looking for seems to be very, very similar. So I think that a lot of what I'm going to present today will be hopefully useful to you. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, and everyone can see the slides?
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Okay. So this is the overview of what we're going to discuss today, and this is informal. So if you have questions as I'm presenting, you don't need to keep the questions until the end. Please feel free to just interrupt and ask your questions. Um, so we're going to go through why are grants important, what are different types of grants, potential funding sources for you as investigators in Ukraine. And then we'll talk about the grant itself in terms of grantsmanship, how to structure grants, common mistakes that are made. And then I'll go through the grant review process. Again, I'm going to focus on what that process looks like in the United States, but similar scoring methods and similar criteria are used at least for the grant opportunities that I've reviewed for within Europe. And then we'll talk just a little bit about, what to do after you get your grant. And so this, just to make sure I don't go over time, I should leave about 10 minutes at the end for questions. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank
Okay,
you.
great. Okay, so why are grants important? For really money is what it comes down to. But it's more than that, because it's easy to say, well, it's just money, but it really is the lifeblood of research, right? It can provide salary support for you as an investigator to be able to do the research. So that you have less time, you can spend less time doing other things and more time focused on the research that you want to do. It can help you hire people to help you do that research. It helps fund the space that you're going to do your research in, the equipment that you're going to use to do research, supplies, infrastructure in general. There's a lot of things that we don't think about, but the building that you're in, requires electricity, requires water. All of those things cost money, and for the research buildings, a lot of that money comes from the grant process and grant structure. For us in the field of radiation oncology, it's particularly important that we do a better job of, trying to aggressively get grants, because grants are the engine that drives academic progress. Without grants, our field will not move forward. And our field is very important when it comes to cancer care. About half of all cancer patients will receive radiation at some point during their disease course. So we're a central modality in the care of cancer patients. Yet, at least in the United States, only about 0.5% or half a percent of NIH funds goes to support radiation oncology research. So we're not doing a very good job as radiation oncologists in competing for these grants. And eventually, what it means is that our field will lag behind. These grants are really, really important, whether in the United States or anywhere else in the world, for creating innovation, right? The ideas that you have are important ideas. And to turn those ideas into a real study, you need to have the ability to do that. And grants are that engine. Grants are where you go from an idea to actually being able to do the work. So, what are different types of grants? There's innumerable types of grants, and each funding source will have its own description of grants. But I've broken them up here in kind of a way that makes sense to me, which is into biomedical research grants, into training grants, and then into infrastructure and equipment grants. And obviously, there's some overlap between these different categories. But in terms of biomedical research grants, there's a number of different avenues for these types of grants. So there's, true basic science research where you're doing work, in the lab with mice or with cells and tissue culture, these types of things. There's translational research where you're looking for biomarkers, you're using tissue banks, you may be using tissues that were collected on a clinical trial. Then there's actual clinical research, which is involving patients, right? So translational research and clinical research, the boundary between those can be quite blurred sometimes. In my mind, if you're doing research on de-identified tissues, then that's translational research. But if the tissues are not de-identified, if they're clinically annotated and connected to patients, then it becomes clinical research, right? And that's the definition that the National Institute of Health also uses for, is this just human subjects research or not, right? Um, in terms of clinical research, the most obvious type of clinical research is a clinical trial, but there's, a number of different types of clinical research. So there's the prospective clinical research, which can include clinical trials, but can also include a number of different categories of research. So a clinical trial generally is what we think of as an interventional prospective research trial, but there's also observational research where we're not actually intervening in any way in the patient's care, but we are prospectively looking at patients to look at their outcomes. We're collecting tissues. We want to find biomarkers of standard treatments, these types of things. And then there's also the retrospective research where we're going to look back and say, okay, we've treated in the past 1,000 patients with disease X, and we want to, go back and try to figure out, are there any features of the way that we did the treatment that made the treatment more or less effective. And then physics research can really fall into any of these three categories, but obviously has some of its own specific nuances in terms of, looking at dosimetry, looking at delivery and workflows of treatment. Imaging research generally would fall under the category of physics. Generally, but that can also be a clinical trial, obviously. So you might be doing a clinical trial where you're looking at a novel imaging technique post-radiation to predict, patient outcomes, these types of things. And then, device innovation, looking at new ways, again, to deliver radiation treatment, these types of things. In the United States, the biomedical research grants are mainly what we call R grants through the National Institutes of Health. And I review this because as investigators from Ukraine, although you're not, these grants are limited to citizens or residents of the United States, but there are exceptions to that rule. And we're going to go over that. But also because this type of structure of the different grant types, most foundations and most other institutions follow the lead of the NIH. And so generally, although their grants may have different names, they follow this same structure of what the grants are. So the R01 is kind of the major grant for doing biomedical research. And this is, mature hypothesis-driven research. These grants are usually 3 to 5 year grants. The grant application absolutely requires preliminary data, and it's very stringent, has to be very, hypothesis-driven, very mechanistic. Everything in the grant has to be very, very clear. Then there's an R03, which are pilot or feasibility grants. Sorry, that should say or, not of. And these grants are much smaller. They're usually 1 to 2 year grants. So an R01 can be $500,000 a year or more. R03s generally are going to be somewhere between $50,000 to $100,000 and over 1 to 2 years. And these are really pilot or feasibility grants, meaning you have a new idea and you want to actually generate preliminary data for your R01. Or you are a researcher who's been focused on, lung cancer, and now you want to, switch fields and you want to look at, rectal cancer or something like that. Then there's the R21, which is kind of like the little brother of the R01. The R21 is a 2 year award, and it can be up to $250,000. And this this grant mechanism does not require preliminary data. You can include preliminary data, and if you do, the preliminary data will be judged and criticized, but it's not required for this type of grant the way that it's required for an R01. And this is generally thought of as a high risk, high reward type of grant, right? So for an R01, when you submit this kind of big R01 type of grant, generally the grant should be submitted and the proposal should be made in a way of, for sure we're going to be successful. There shouldn't be really any questions about the success of the project. The R21 is different. The R21 is a grant that is used for projects that might be successful but might not, right? But if they are successful, can really be very important. And a lot of times the R21 mechanism is used before the R01 to de-risk a project, right? So let's say you have an idea for a really good project, but the project requires a new model that doesn't exist. So you might use the R03 or the R21 to create that model, and then your R01 will now have the preliminary data on that model that you're using. And then R35, I think, is a grant mechanism that is fairly unique to the NIH, which is an investigator support grant, and it's a newer mechanism. So this type of grant, rather than supporting a project, supports an investigator. It basically says, this investigator has done enough important research that we're just going to support the investigator to do whatever kind of research they want to do. Right? So it's a little bit of a different mechanism. Usually this doesn't exist in most kind of foundations and these types of things. But usually these other types of mechanisms do, where you'll have kind of an investigator-initiated research grant, or they'll call it like a program, or excuse me, a project grant or things like this. And then usually the things that are more like the R03 or the R21, they'll call kind of pilot grants, feasibility grants, these types of things. So you will usually have this larger and this smaller grant mechanism for most foundations. Okay, and then education grants, these can fall into kind of three categories as well. And education grants can fall into workforce development grants. Through the NIH, these are generally what are called T grants, right? So this is a grant where you as an institution are saying, we want to create a training program to train radiation oncologists. We want to train, we want to start a radiation physics training program. We want to start a program in our cancer center to teach our junior faculty and our postdocs how to do translational research. This is the type of grant. So this type of grant doesn't go to an individual, it goes to an institution. You may still have an individual who's the PI, but the grant is for the institution to create really a training program, right? A workforce development. Then there's career development programs. These are known as K grants, and these are generally going to investigators, individuals, to help them with their career development. These are also sometimes called mentored grants. Usually they're going to investigators at earlier points in their career. And in these grants, a common mistake that I see is there's too much focus on the research project and not enough focus on the career development. So the most important part of these grants is what they are. It's a career development grant. So if you don't have good mentors, if you don't have mentors that are demonstrating their commitment to your training, if you don't have a good training plan of very clear outcomes. So like an example would be, I want to do immunology research, and my career development grant is going to teach me how to do immunology research. Well, how is it going to teach me how to do immunology research? I'm going to take course X that's going to teach me how to do flow cytometry. I'm going to take course Y through the university in basic immunology. My mentor is going to meet with me once a week to review major advancements in the field. So those are the types of things that they're looking for. The project that you're proposing is also important, but equally, if not more important, is actually the plan for the career development. And then training grants are similar to career development grants, but they're F grants. So these are for people who are still in training, right? Career development grants, K grants, things like K-08s, K-12s are generally for people who have either already have their MD or their PhD, whereas the training grants are for people who are earlier in their careers and can also go to people who don't have those degrees yet. And then finally, there's infrastructure grants, right? And these can also fall into kind of a few different categories. Again, I've tried to kind of split this up in a way that makes sense, but there's obviously overlap between these different categories. So in terms of infrastructure grants, these are grants that aren't really to support a project or a specific type of research, but they are grants that are there for developing the ability to do research, right? So our institution doesn't have a flow cytometer. We want to get a flow cytometer. That would be a major equipment grant or capacity building grant. Our institution doesn't have the ability to do this certain kind of, H&E staining or something like that. So we're going to use this to do that. Or, sometimes there's overlap between these capacity building grants and the T grants, right? Because sometimes these training grants can also build capacity. And so there's some overlap there. But the idea here is that this is more about building resources as opposed to equipment, the capacity building grants. So it may even be a grant to create a resource that is needed in the field. So maybe, like you say, within the field, we need a mouse model that has these characteristics and it doesn't exist, and this will drive the field forward. So you could have a capacity building grant that's really building this resource. It's not a scientific project. You're not asking a scientific question. You're creating a resource. And then finally, are grants that are there just to support conferences or meetings. And so these, again, you could argue fall a little bit under education grants, but really because they're for discrete meetings tend to fall more under infrastructure grants. Okay, so what are potential funding sources for you all as investigators from Ukraine? Again, this is definitely not my area of expertise. Natalia was kind enough to help me with some resources, and then just my own research, as well as Perplexity, which is a very good AI. I use these different sources to find a number of different funding sources that are out there. So the NIH. So as I mentioned, NIH, you have to be a United States citizen or resident to get an NIH grant, but there are exceptions to that. Right? So you can partner with an institution in the United States or an investigator in the United States, and you can get a grant, but there has to be a foreign justification, right? Well, what does that mean, a foreign justification? Basically, what it means is you have to be able to say that without me, this grant can't be done. So it may be that you have a particular expertise that no one else in the world has. But more often what it is that you have a situation that allows for that kind of research, right? So for example, the unfortunate truth in Ukraine right now is the war that is going on. But that also is a way where you could say, okay, we want to do research on what are the effects of, war on cancer care and delivery. Well, that can't be done right now in the United States because there's, not a war ongoing here. So that's a very crude example, but it's an example of what might be. Or let's say, someone is from a country in Africa where Burkitt's lymphoma is very, very common, right? So again, that might be, well, there's not enough of this kind of cancer in the United States to study it thoroughly, so we have to have this foreign partnership to allow that study. Or there might be some kind of environmental exposure again doesn't exist in the United States, but does exist in this entity. So those are ways to get the foreign justifications. It's either, an individual talent that just is very unique, or it has, a situation or a type of cancer or an exposure that doesn't exist in the United States. Other funding sources, industry funding sources, and you can use industry funding sources for both preclinical and clinical studies. So companies like Merck, Genentech, BMS, Pfizer, they will also fund preclinical research if it falls within their portfolio of interest. Some people have, moral, ethical issues about partnering with companies. I do not. To be honest with you, I have a number of different industry partnerships. I'm just very clear that the industry has one goal, and I have a goal that sometimes overlaps with that, but is different, right? We both want to find a good treatment for patients with cancer. I want to find a good treatment that is good for patients with cancer at any cost. They want to find a good treatment for patients with cancer that will make them money, right? But so you have to just focus on the overlap, and you have to be honest, when you're presenting data, when you're publishing, about who funded that data, right? So you have to present, well, this is a potential conflict of interest. Yes, I'm presenting this Genentech drug, did really well, but this, Genentech gave me money to do this research. That's a conflict of interest. And, those conflicts exist, and they're okay as long as you acknowledge them and you're not trying to hide them. And I think most of us as physicians, are wise enough to make sure that we're putting our patients first, not an industry partner or a drug company first. Then there's professional societies. So a few different professional societies that you could turn to are ASTRO, AAPM, RSNA, and ESTRO. In my research, I think, with the exception of some very specific initiatives, like this initiative, that we're part of today, ASTRO, AAPM, and RSNA are probably not great resources in general. They will make exceptions for certain initiatives, but in general, most of their grants will have limited international opportunities. Most of their grants are actually for people in training, and most of those will require you to be in a United States residency program or training program. Estro, however, does have more opportunities for you here in the Ukraine. All right, so foundations, and so the last kind of category here is the foundations and international funding sources, and we're going to spend more time on these because I think these are kind of better opportunities for you all. So there's the EU Horizon grants. And recently, I think just this last September, there was a large grant that came out from the EU Horizon, which was Ukraine Cancer Research Building Capacity Grant that I think was up to 5 million euros. I know that has expired, but in digging a little deeper, it sounds like there might be another similar call coming forward from EU Horizon. I don't know, Natalia, you may know more about that than I do.
Yes, it's coming, and it's opening up in September. We're also participating and collaborating with our European partners and participating in writing this grant.
Yeah. So that's a fantastic resource. There's the UICC for Solidarity Fund that has a few different opportunities there. Rad Aid was an interesting one because they don't have necessarily biomedical research grants that I could find, but they do have actually great infrastructure grants. Then there's Hug, which has also kind of partnered with Astro. Again, I couldn't find through Hug a number, biomedical research grants, but there are educational grants through there. And then there's the International Association for Atomic Energy, and they have a number of different grants there that are looking at radiation safety. And those grants, again, can be, I think, looking at the calls, a number of them can be used for biomedical research, particularly, I think, if you're looking at new ways of radiation delivery, if you're looking at, new devices, these types of things. I think all of those are would be quite amenable to that.
IAEA, if I may add a little bit, so they currently started the HR workforce development grant for Ukraine specifically, and I think they have allocated approximately 2 million to radiation oncology and radiology. So that's also a great opportunity. Some of attendees here in this lecture participated as experts in the developing this grant.
Oh, fantastic. And then there's the World Health Organization. Again, I didn't find any specific grants through the World Health Organization, but I did find that they are partnering with a number of different societies. There's the St. Jude's Safer Grant. And I think this is actually a great opportunity for you all because it's pediatrics focused. And I think that there are some very interesting questions that you could ask about the delivery and care of pediatric cancer in the current environment in Ukraine that I think would fall very, very nicely into the scope of these safer grants that St. Jude's has. And these safer grants for St. Jude's are open, internationally. There's CRDF global grants, and then the other, grants that I thought were quite interesting were the grants through the WCRF, which is the World Cancer Research Fund International. There should actually be an I at the end of that, I guess. But these grants are specifically for people not in the Americas. So it's for, Europe, Asia, Africa. And so they kind of, again, like the NIH type of setup, they have these larger grants, which are the investigator-initiated grants. Those are 500,000 British pounds. And those grants can be for several years. And then they have 1 to 2 year pilot grants that are 60,000 British pounds. So that also looks like a great funding resource that may be out there and available to you all. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and get into grantsmanship. And we're running a little bit tight on time here, so I will because we finish at the hour. Is that correct?
No, we have 1 hour, 30 minutes for the
Oh,
lecture.
1 hour. Okay, all right. Well, then we're fine on time. Okay, so in terms of grantsmanship, the main question that I always tell my trainees to think about is why is this important and why me? Right? These are the two things that you should think about when you're writing a grant. Like, why do I want to ask this question? And why am I the right person to be asking this question? And I think if you can answer that, then that's the foundation for a very strong grant, right? If you can't answer that, then then you're going to struggle a little bit, I think. So in terms of why is it important, right? What we're talking about there is the significance of the grant. And I think there's a few things to think about because there are, questions that are interesting. And those questions can be significant. But what will create even more significance is a question that is interesting, but that will also provide a solution, right? So, there's, questions like, why is the grass green? Well, we fund those kinds of research that doesn't have a clear application because we know that the knowledge itself sometimes can create unexpected applications, right? Um, but if you have a question that has a very clear endpoint of, well, when we answer this question with the knowledge, this is what we're going to do, that increases the significance even more. Okay. And particularly when you're talking about something that is translatable to humans, right? So if you're doing basic science research and you're asking a question in a way that is very translatable to the clinic, that increases the significance even more. And then the why me, I think this is really the innovation, right? How am I going to be able to answer this question that no one else can do? What am I bringing to the table? Is it the resources that I have? Do I have a new model? Do I have a specific database that's very unique? Whatever it is, that's the innovation part of the grant, is what is it about me that is innovative that allows me to answer this important question, and gives me and makes me the best person in the world to answer this question. Right? Then there's the deliverables. And I was getting to this a little bit with the significance. Deliverables is really the impact of the grant. And when we talk about, at least in the NIH, when we talk about how we score the grants, we call it an impact score. The final score is an impact score because we score the grant based on, do we think this is going to impact the field or not? Is it going to create a bunch of knowledge that's not impactful? Even if the grant is very successful, then it's not an important grant, right? So this comes down to what we call the deliverables, meaning if your grant is successful, what you want to make sure that you make it very, very clear is what will be gained, right? In terms of knowledge, in terms of new resources, et cetera, right? So, for example, we're doing a grant on, let's say just for example, on B cell biology, right? So the deliverables might be, well, if our grant is successful, we're going to uncover new biology about how, B cells become activated. B, we're going to potentially create an opportunity for new drugs to target B cells to make them more active. So you want to make it just very clear and outlined. And this is not just for biomedical research grants, right? This is also true for infrastructure grants and for educational grants. So if you're doing an educational grant, the deliverable has to be the people that are being educated. So at the end of this, if we're given this grant and we're allowed to do this work, at the end of this, we're going to have trained 25 researchers who will now be able to, write clinical trials and do, an advanced clinical research within Ukraine, these types of things. So whatever it is, you want to just make it very, very clear to the reader what is going to happen as a result of this grant. That's what we call the deliverables. Then if you have all of those things, you have a strong grant, but you still need the rigor and approach, right? So it's great to say that, this is a great idea. I have a great way to do it. When we do this, we're going to really create things that are going to drive the field forward. We're going to have great deliverables. But if you haven't designed the grant in a way that's doable, then none of that matters, right? Because you're not going to get that endpoint. And this is where actually a lot of people stumble. And it's, we'll get into this when we talk about the mistakes, but making sure that the rigor and approach, and this is also where preliminary data is important, right? To demonstrate that, oh, well, actually, we're proposing to do this new method, and we've done this method before. Here's the data. It works. So in terms of grantsmanship, just some things to think about. The most important part of the grant is the specific aims page. So this is usually most grants require this, and it's a one-page summary of the grant that will outline the aims of the grant. Um, and this is really where you should start writing your grant, is with the specific aims page. You want to have, generally, depending on the type of grant, 2 to 3 aims, sometimes 4 aims. You want the aims to be testable. You want them to match the funding opportunity that you're going for, right? So if the funding opportunity has specific things that it's calling for and your aims don't meet that, then, no matter how good of a grant it is, that funding opportunity is not interested in your grant. You want to make sure that it matches your data, it matches the budget. And you want to have a central hypothesis and expected outcome for each aim, right? So you want to basically, and the expected outcome, in part, that's the deliverable, right? What is going to happen when we do this aim? What is the outcome going to be? What are we going to get? Right. So for different types of grants, the hypothesis and having it be very mechanistic becomes more or less important. But in general, I think if it's a research grant, I think it always has to be, each aim has to have a hypothesis. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that you don't want the aims to depend on each other too much, right? Because then what the reviewers will say, this is like a very classic thing that you hear, is that the aims are interdependent, meaning that if aim 1 isn't successful, then the rest of the grant is useless because you can't do aim 2 and aim 3, right? So you don't want to design a grant like that. You want to design a grant where the aims are related but interdependent, such that even if aim 1 isn't successful, aim 2 can still have the potential to be successful. This is very important, which is right for busy reviewers, right? You want your grant to be clear. Usually I will, after I read the specific aims page, have a very good idea of how I'm going to score the grant. Then I use the rest of the grant to either convince myself that my initial kind of score was correct or is incorrect, right? So that specific aims page is very important, but then the rest of the grant, in terms of how it's written, how it supports it, is really, really important. And you want it to be clear. You don't want it to be too crowded. You don't want the reader to have to do a lot of research and digging to try to figure out what you're talking about. So in general, the reviewer is going to have an expertise in biomedical research, but not necessarily in your specific area. So you have to make sure that it's written detailed enough to demonstrate your expertise, but also globally kind of clear enough that someone who doesn't have that kind of expertise can understand why this is important, what you're proposing to do. Okay. You have to prove significance and feasibility, right? And this is again where the preliminary data comes into place if you're talking about a basic science grant. So you want to connect the project to an unmet need or disease burden. You want to back claims with preliminary data, and you want to talk about what is new, what is this grant doing that's going to add to the field. And then in terms of feasibility, you want, the team is part of the feasibility. Now, interestingly, in the new NIH grant format, before we used to actually critique the team and give a score for the team. We don't do that anymore. Now it's simply a yes or no. Can the team do this research or can they not do this research? So that has changed in NIH grants, but looking at other grant opportunities, this is still a very important part of most other grant opportunities. So it's still something to keep in mind. Make sure that your grant, I had already mentioned this, aligns with the mechanism, right? Make sure that the aims align with what are the goals of the funding mechanism. And then make it painless to read. And I've bolded this point here add clean figures that explain the design fast, right? So you want to have pictures, not every picture in the grant has to be data. You can have pictures or tables in the grant that explain what it is that you're planning to do, right? But if the picture isn't clean, sometimes I've seen people that will put a picture in there of, oh, this is what, and the picture is actually no more clear than the text. So that's not helpful. So this is where again, having someone else, and this gets us to the next point, having someone else read your grant and give you feedback and give you honest feedback, right? So you want to write your grant far enough ahead of when it's due that you can give it to people, give them plenty of time to read it, give you good feedback, and then and then make those changes and then submit the grant. The key thing here is I would give it not necessarily to someone who has the same expertise as me, right? I would try to give it to someone who has good general expertise in the field, but not necessarily that expertise, because there will invariably there's things that you're going to say or put in your grant that to you are obvious, but are not obvious to the grant reviewer. And it's very difficult to understand that because you have your set of knowledge that you think is just kind of general knowledge, but it may not be, right? Um, so I think it's really important keeping the grants, not too crowded, and then organizing the grants in a way that make them very easy to read. When you're designing the grant, think about what the reviewer is looking at, right? So the reviewer wants to know, is this an important question, right? Does the problem matter and does it move the field forward? Okay. Is it feasible? Okay. So now it's an important question, but can you actually do what you say you're going to do? Right. Let's say you're saying, oh, well, we want to figure out if this new treatment is better, we're going to do a clinical trial. We need 10,000 patients to do the clinical trial, but we see 5 of these patients a year. That's not very feasible. So even if the question is very important, even if the drug is very interesting. And then, this comes back to what we were just talking about, readable. You don't want to, you're not writing a mystery novel. You want from the beginning to the end, you want to make the end very clear, even at the beginning. You don't want it to be, oh, I'm going to keep the reader in suspense and then let them know what we're planning. No, you want it just very clear and repetitive. You want to repeat the important points over and over and over again within the grant. Okay, so grant structure. There's a basic structure to R01 grants that is used for a number of different funding agencies as well. And generally, what this looks like is there's going to be a project summary or abstract, sometimes and abstract, right? And these two pieces of information are a little bit different. So generally, one is written as a short scientific abstract meant for scientists, and it is meant to help them determine who are the right people to review your grant. The narrative or the abstract part of it, there can also be a layman's term part of it where it's a much shorter one, and really you just want to say in plain language why, what is it that this grant is proposing, right? So generally for the NIH, they will also have non-scientists, right, that will look at grants, and this is really meant for them. This is particularly important actually for DoD grants and VA grants and things like this. Then there's the specific aims page, right? Which is the most important page. It's basically a summary of the whole grant, and one page lists your aims there. And then you have really the research strategy, which can include the background and significance and and innovation, right? So usually for like an NIH grant, you have 12 pages for the research strategy. The background and significance and the innovation gets included into that research strategy part, as does the approach or the methods, right? And I've put here under methods, you have to include hypotheses as well as alternative hypotheses. And I'm going to get into what that means in a minute. And then there's preliminary data, and the preliminary data can be used to show the feasibility of your approach. But your preliminary data can also be used to show your innovation and your background and significance, right? So here's the data that shows why this question is important. And then generally at the end of the grant, you want to have a little section for timeline and milestones. The team and environment is always going to be important. And then a budget and justification for that budget. Okay, so I'm going to stop this presentation here, and I'm just going to very briefly go through one of my grants. Give me just a second here. Um, okay. Okay, can you all see my screen here?
Yeah, we can see.
Okay. So this is a one of my R01 grants, and this is one that was funded. So I'm going to show you kind of what this grant looks like. So this is the whole package that gets sent to the NIH. Now, again, every different grant will have different things that are on there, right? Um, and the key thing here is that it'll show the investigators. So it'll show you who the primary investigator is, and then who are co-investigators on the grant. And then we're just going to kind of skip through some of these pages, which are more just administrative pages. And we're going to go to the project summary and abstract and the narrative. And let me just make this a little bigger so it all fits. Okay. So again, the abstract here is kind of like a scientific abstract. It's almost like a mini specific aims page. And this is roughly about half a page. And you notice that this is very dense because I only have half a page in here. But what I have done is I've kind of highlighted the things that I want to draw their attention to. So I've highlighted our hypothesis, and then I've highlighted why this is important. What are going to be the deliverables? What will be the outcome of this? Now, the narrative you can see is much shorter, and it's not written scientifically. The narrative is really just meant for kind of a layperson to be able to read and have a general idea of what the grant is. Okay. Then after this, we have facilities and resources. This basically lists, showing the environment and that we have the resources that we need to do the proposed study. So it lists kind of, what are the resources that we have, what are the equipment that's important for the research that we're doing. And then after that, you get into the budget. You get into the bio sketches. And the bio sketches are basically just a short version of the CV for each person that's listed on the grant. But again, this is important that it's designed in a way to demonstrate what is each person's contribution to the grant. Why is it important that they're part of the team? What expertise are they bringing to the team? You'll also describe that in the grant, but it has to be supported here. You have to show, okay, this person has published, 10 papers on this technique that they're on the grant to help us with this technique, these types of things. Okay. And then so after this, you get to the budget. And for the budget, the important part of the budget is kind of the budget justification, which is what I'm trying to get to here. Sorry, there's a lot of administrative pages. But so this is the budget justification. So it starts with the personnel on the budget. and it goes through kind of how much time of support we're asking for each person. And again, what they're contributing, what are they doing specifically on the grant? Okay. Sometimes people won't read the bio sketches because, as you could see, they're quite long and there's a number of them. They'll look here first to see, okay, what is each person contributing to the grant? Then there's other personnel. These are people who are not co-investigators, but are important for the grant. So you may have a specific person in here, or you may say, you know what, we haven't even hired this person yet, but we're going to hire a technician or a grad student or these types of things. And then if there's any major equipment that you want to purchase, you're going to include that in the budget and why that's there. Any travel for traveling to meetings, et cetera, you're going to include that there. And then the actual kind of main part of the budget, which is kind of the supplies and materials and these types of things. Okay. And so for each thing that you're doing, you want to just provide a brief justification of this is why we need the money. This is what we're doing it for. Okay. The bigger the grant, the more money that you're asking for, the more detail you need in the budget, obviously. So then after that, we have, so this was a resubmission grant. So what we have here is basically what we call the introduction page. So basically, I'd submitted this grant. The reviewers gave me their criticism. The grant didn't get funded. So what this page does is it basically outlines how have I changed the grant in response to the reviewers to make it better. And then this is the grant itself. So this is the specific aims page. And so you can see that I basically provide some background. I talk about our hypothesis and why this is important. And then I go through what are each specific aim, right? And how are we doing the research very broadly? And what are we going to gain from each of these aims? So then we go into on this page, this starts the research strategy. And so we start with the significance, and this is kind of also the background. And so you can see here that I include preliminary data that is kind of critical for the question that we're asking. Okay. So this grant is about looking at obesity and how obesity causes radio resistance. So I'm showing, up here, I talk about the clinical studies that suggest that obese patients do worse with radiation. And then down here, I show, well, actually, in our mice, when we give them radiation, obese mice do worse, right? So this is kind of key preliminary data that demonstrates that the question that I'm asking is important. So it goes into the significance. Same thing here and here. These are all kind of important, preliminary data to support the question that we're asking. Right. And then there's the innovation where I outline, okay, what are we doing that's really kind of important? What new methods are we using to answer these questions? Why am I the right person to be doing this research? Okay. And then within the approach, this is where we then go into the aims and we become more granular about what we're doing for each aim. And there's a few things that I want you to notice here within the approach. The first is that I make it very easy to read in terms of I use these bullet points. Some people will actually highlight this area in a separate color for each aim. But I make it very easy. I have, spaces in here so that they know, okay, so this is the start of specific aim 1. Okay. And then each aim, you'll notice, is structured the same. So first, I have some preliminary data, again, for feasibility. So in this aim, I'm going to use diet-induced obese mouse models. So figure 5, I'm just demonstrating to them what my diet-induced obese mouse model is. I'm showing them that it's feasible. This is what the mice look like. I've made these mice before, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Then I go into the sub-aims, which is where we get into the actual questions that are being asked by that aim, right? Because each aim usually will ask a couple of questions, not just one question. If your aim is just asking one question, then you may not have sub-aims, which is also okay. Now, the structure of every single aim within this grant is the same, right? So I start by describing what we're going to do. And you don't have to structure it this way necessarily, but I think these components are important. Then I have predicted outcomes alternative hypothesis testing, which means what do I think is going to happen? And if the results that I get are different, actually, than what I thought I was going to get, what would be my alternative hypothesis and how will I test that? Then I have a section for pitfalls and alternative strategies, meaning these are the things I think that maybe could go wrong. If it goes wrong, then this is what I'm going to do, right? So again, you don't want to leave the reviewer guessing, oh, well, what if this doesn't work? Or I know that this model sometimes has this problem. How are you going to address that? You want to make that very clear that you've thought about that, that you have a plan for how you're going to address that. And then finally, this part, the statistical considerations, is very, very important. People forget this part of grants a lot, but this is where you demonstrate that actually I can, I can do what I'm going to say I'm going to do, right? So I'm saying that basically I need 10 mice per group. And the reason is that this will give me 80% power to detect a twofold difference in the means between these groups, right? And my preliminary data shows that that's about what I expect to see, right? Now, I will always put in there, right? Um, uh, that you can always adjust the numbers if needed, right? If we find that our estimates of power were incorrect, then we will adjust the numbers. But they want to see that you've given some thought to actually, okay, how many mice do I need? How many patients do I need to be able to detect a difference, right? Now, this sub-aim 1B is a little bit more mechanistic. So you'll notice it still has these same parts to it, right? It has this predicted outcomes, alternative hypothesis testing. After I outline what I'm going to do, right? Um, and you can see here our readouts and assays are described below, and I make it very clear. I just list them. Number one, flow cytometry. This is what we're doing. Number two, ex vivo evaluation of T cell function, tetramer staining, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in the predicted outcomes, now I'm basically saying this is what I expect to see from these different assays. This is the information that I expect to gain from these assays, right? And then again, in the pitfalls and alternative strategies, going through, okay, well, if this assay doesn't work, then I'm going to use this assay, which I think will provide the same kind of data. And then statistical considerations, now you can see that it's much more robust here because what we're doing is statistically more complicated. But again, this section is important because if it's not there, then I can't justify that actually my project is feasible, right? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Oh, actually, I did want to show this. So you can see I have these tables in here because I start to use some models that are actually quite complicated. And so I want to make it very clear to the reviewer what each model is and what I expect to see, right? So I'm using these 4 different models, and I tell them, well, this is what I expect to see in the cancer cell. This is what I expect to see in the immune system. This is what the levels of this hormone look like in this model, and this is the outcome that I expect for this model. So it makes it very clear to the reviewer, okay, these are the models that are being used, and these are why I'm using it, and these are the outcomes that are expected. Same thing down here. I do the same thing here again because we're using some complicated models where we're basically using different types of mice, adoptively transferring in different immune cells into those mice. And so, again, making it very clear using a table here. Sometimes you might want to use a diagram, but just providing a very clear way for the reviewer to make it easy for them if they're having trouble when they're reading it because, they're reading maybe 10 of these, right? So I want it to be very, very clear to them with these tables of exactly what I'm planning to do. Okay. So I'll go ahead and stop there. And then the other thing that I wanted to, show here, is okay. So this is instructions for a grant from the World Cancer Research Fund International, right? And basically what I wanted to do was just go through and show you that how, although it's different, it's basically the same components, right? So you have this application summary, 1,000 words, and then you want to talk about the lead applicant and the co-applicants, right? So your team, you're going to include your CV, and then you're going to do a scientific abstract as well as a lay abstract, and then the research proposal itself, again, you're going to have your background, you're going to have your hypothesis and objectives, and then you're going to have your study design here. Now, this is obviously much smaller in terms of the amount of space that you're given to do these things, but the components are the same. Okay. Um, Again, here, the impact and future directions, and then the budget justification. So you can see that all of these components are very similar to the components that are there, but different grants will provide you different amount of space to do these things. When you're provided less space, sometimes it's even more difficult because you have to be very, very concise. You want to demonstrate your expertise. You want to demonstrate that this is an important problem, but you also have limited space and you want to use that space very, very wisely. Okay. So I just wanted to kind of show that to you that these a lot of these components are the same regardless of the grant mechanism that you're using. Um, And then the next kind of topic that we're going to go into is the scoring of the grants, um, and then I'll come back and go through the common mistakes. But before I start sharing that other screen, I'm just going to share this with you.
Thank you for sharing your grant. That was really amazing experience.
Yeah, no, happy to do it. And I'm, if it's always good to have other people's grants as like a template to,
Yeah.
you see it the way that a few different people have done it, and then,
Mhm.
you can take what you think makes the most sense for you from different grants and use them for your grants. Okay, so this is the review template for the NIH. I just kind of wanted to show this to you.
Mhm.
So when we fill this out, I'm part of a study section. We're going to write an overall impact statement. So it says write a clear, concise paragraph that explains the basis for your score. Identify and weigh the most important strengths and weaknesses of the application. So we do that here, and we give an overall score. Then the three kind of scored criteria. So one is the importance of the research. So this is significance and innovation. Okay. Then it's the rigor and feasibility. So the approach that's being taken, is the approach rigorous? Is it feasible? Do they have preliminary data demonstrating that they can do what they say they're going to do? And then you can see here is the expertise and resources, right? Um, and so here you basically can click on appropriate or that additional expertise or resources would be needed. Okay. And then these additional review criteria are things that can affect the score. So it's about protection for human subjects, the appropriate use of vertebrate animals, biohazards, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's these other additional review criteria. These don't affect the score. These are non-scorable criteria. So I just wanted you to kind of see that form. These are the forms that we use to review grants at the NIH. And now I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint. Okay. So, some common mistakes that are made in writing grants. One is proposing things you have never done or don't know how to do. Uh, if you do this, this is where you should find a collaborator that knows what they're doing, right? So there's everything in science these days requires multiple different expertise. And so being a good collaborator is important. So if you don't find a collaborator that knows what they're doing and you just try to kind of, wing it, chances are you're going to make a mistake that is fatal to the grant, right? So, for example, I was reviewing a grant from someone who has found a mechanism that they think is important in natural killer cells, but they're not a natural killer cell biologist, right? They are, a B cell biologist, and they found this mechanism that's important in B cells, and they found, oh, it's also expressed in natural killer cells. We want to explore it in natural killer cells. Well, when they wrote their grant, the markers that they were going to use to explore natural killer cells, and they were using two different mouse strains, those markers only work in one mouse strain. They don't actually work in the other mouse strain. So they can't actually even detect the natural killer cells in the other mouse strain. So very simple error, right? But now their grant is not feasible because they can't actually do the work that they said they're going to do. Because, and I could say, well, they'll figure that out, but that's, as a reviewer, you're not allowed to do that, right? As a reviewer, you just have to evaluate what's in front of you. And sometimes it's really frustrating because you're like, oh, this is great. I wish they had just not made this mistake or not did this. But you have very limited wiggle room to do that because you have to be fair to all the grants. So not knowing the field in general, so make sure you've read, right? If you propose things or if you are submitting a grant, you should assume that probably experts in the field are going to review your grant. So you want to know what those experts have written, right? If you're going to propose something in a grant that is similar to what someone else has done, you probably want to include their paper in your grant, right? You want to reference their paper. If you're going to oppose an idea that someone has put out there, again, you want to, quote their paper and say, this is what they found, and their data was great, but what we're seeing is this, and we think this could be the reason why it's different, et cetera, et cetera. So another mistake is not getting feedback on your grant or rushing to submit the grant, right? So not giving yourself enough time to write it and get feedback. Another common mistake is a grant that is overly ambitious and not focused. So you're proposing to do too much, you're trying to answer too many questions. Another common mistake is giving up, right? So most grants don't get funded. I will tell you, I've never had a grant that's been funded the first time that I've submitted it. Never in my life. And I'll tell you that, probably if the grants that I submit, eventually only about 1 in 5 gets funded, right? So about 80% of the work that I do is never gets funded. But the process of writing a grant is important because it makes you think about the question, right? It makes you, and it also will serve, I use my grants, I write them in a way that it serves as the template for the work we're actually going to do. So when my grad students come to me and they say, well, what do you think we should do next? I ask them, have you read the grant? Because it says in the grant what I think we should do next, right? Now, sometimes you'll change the plans and those types of things, but that's, important. And then not having the statistical considerations in the grant, right? Not demonstrating that you can do, what you said you're going to do. So in terms of the grant review process, I just kind of showed you the form that we use, but this is generally how grants are scored for the NIH, but also for most other committees. It's a 1 to 9 scale, with 1 being the best score and 9 being the worst score, right? And so 5 is the average score. So a 1 would be something that is exceptionally strong with almost no weaknesses, right? And then like a 3 would be very strong with just minor weaknesses. Once you start to get into moderate or major weaknesses in the grant, then that starts to drive your score down into these sections, right? So to get a fundable score, at least through the NIH, your grant has to fall into this top category, 1, 2, 3. Okay. And then so post grant, what should you do once you've gotten a grant, once you've gotten the grant assigned? Well, you should do the work, right? But you should also make sure that you have the systems in place to make sure that you're keeping track and documenting the work that you're doing, right? So make sure that the lab notebooks are being upkept properly, et cetera, et cetera. Each year, you're going to be asked most likely to submit a report of what you've accomplished that year and what you plan to accomplish the next year based on the initial proposal that you submitted. So it is important, even if you're not haven't published anything. If you've published something, great. You just say, okay, we published this, and you use pictures from figures from the publication. But oftentimes you're not going to publish something in the first year or 2 years of having the grant. Um, okay, so next I'm going to go through one of the grants that was submitted. If this is your grant, I don't want you to feel like I've singled you out negatively, so I hope nobody takes it that way. I actually picked this because I thought it was a great idea, so I was really interested in it when I was looking at it, but I just wanted to kind of point out something, right? So evaluating the impact of nicotine replacement products on side effects and treatment breaks in radiotherapy for head and neck, lung, and esophageal cancer perspective. So definitely very interesting question, right? We know that tobacco can cause worse outcomes, and we want to see if we can get patients off of tobacco and use nicotine replacement. Can we improve their outcomes by reducing side effects and reducing treatment breaks? Very clear question, very important question. So I like it. Right. Now, here, when it comes to the actual description, and I realize that with these grants, you all didn't have, that much room. But for, let's say, if you're writing this for a more robust grant application, this part is where you need more detail, right? So here you would need to say, well, we expect there to be this much of a difference. And why do you expect there to be that much of a difference, right? So we expect there to be 50% less grade 3 toxicity when we use nicotine replacement, right? Um, and so you would want to really specify what you're expecting to see, and then how many patients do we need, right? Because you're saying you're going to do a statistical analysis to compare the two groups, but are you going to have enough patients for that statistical analysis to be meaningful? Right. So these are the things to think about. The devil is always in the details, as they say, particularly when it comes to clinical trials and these types of things. So I just wanted to use that as one example, but I really liked this idea. So I hope whoever's approached this or whoever's grant this was, you don't take it negatively that I used yours as an example. I actually used it as an example because I liked it. Okay. So, do you want me to do the questions now, or?
I think we can skip, or maybe let's do your favorite one, just to track attendance, and then we can open the floor for questions. Yeah.
Sure. So why
Which
don't
one
we
would you prefer?
Let's do this one.
Okay. Question 4. So please answer. What are the best grants? So hopefully everyone answers correctly. It's an easy one. So
Yeah.
while people are answering, there is a question in the chat from Dr. Shafil. How do you choose organization to write the grant application for? And is it possible to apply to multiple organizations?
Yeah, so I think in terms of choosing the organization to apply for, you want to make sure that you're eligible to apply from that organization, right? So that's the most important thing is will they even accept a grant from me? Um, then the second thing is, does that organization have in their funding announcement what it is that they're hoping to fund, right? Some are very general, some are, but no matter what, there's always some degree of, okay, this is what we want to fund. Even if it's just
Mhm.
funding cancer research, right?
Mhm.
That's still a limitation. They're going to fund research on cancer. But usually it's more specific than that, right? So you want to make sure that the funding announcement aligns with the project that you want to do, right? So if, for example, a foundation says, we want to, we're looking for applications for grants that are looking to, educate the general public on cancer prevention and what the general public can do for cancer prevention, and you're submitting a grant that is about, SBRT versus, non-SBRT for lung cancer, it doesn't fit the grant. They're not even going to review that.
Mhm.
Um, so you need to make sure that it fits the funding announcement. And then the other thing that's an important consideration is how much money is available for that grant, right? And absolutely, yes, you can submit your grant to multiple institutions. Um, Generally, institutions will ask you, or foundations will ask you for a a research funding page when your grant gets funded to make sure that it doesn't overlap, right? So if you submit the same exact project to two different foundations and it gets funded by both, then you'll have to pick which one you want. You can't take both, unless you lie, which you shouldn't do, because then you'll put yourself in a situation where you can never get a grant again, right?
Mhm.
And generally you're going to pick the one that, that provides you with the most money. Um, so for example, I can put in a grant to the NIH and to the DoD, and it can be very, very similar. Um, what they will ask me for is, okay, what are the specific aims? If the grant gets funded, what are the specific aims of your other grant that got funded? And if there's too much overlap, they'll say there's too much overlap. You either have to get rid of that grant or you have to get rid of this grant.
Got it. Yeah, that's a clear explanation. Thank you so much. So we have a great participation, and 92% actually answered focused and feasible. So
Which is
that,
the correct answer. Yeah.
yay. Okay, awesome. I'm opening the floor for questions and discussions. We don't have that much time, but maybe a few questions. While people are getting themselves to maybe ask a question, please turn on the microphone, camera if you want to ask, or you can just type in the chat. I will just ask very quickly on behalf of the Ukrainian audience. Many of them never written a grant application, and that would be their first grant. And then if you remember the time when you were writing your first grant, what advice would you give them on writing that first grant?
So I would definitely try to find whichever foundation that you're applying to. I would try to find other successful grants that have gone to that foundation
Mhm.
and look at them and use them as an outline for what
Oh,
you're
very
doing.
good.
Yeah,
Mhm.
even if your grant is on a completely different topic, just the way that the grant is organized can be
Mhm.
really helpful. Now, usually most foundations will have examples of
Yeah.
successfully funded grants that you can
Mhm.
look at and use to for that purpose. The other advice that I would give is definitely have other people, preferably people who have, had successful grant submissions, review your grant before you submit it.
Mhm.
And then
It's
the
great advice.
thing I would say is if your grant doesn't get funded, don't be disheartened. Keep trying.
That's very important, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, persistence there. Excellent. I was wondering, in the era of AI, do you see a lot of grants written by AI? And um, do the reviewers also use AI to review grants?
Um,
What's the
yeah, so I use AI not
climate?
so much to write grants, but I'll use AI to help me do research. Um,
Mhm.
So I will, so for example, if I'm writing a grant and I want to say, like, I'll say, I have these two papers that show this point. Can you find me a paper that shows like a counterpoint? But so I'll use AI to help me kind of do those types of things. But even then, I double check it because sometimes AI just makes things up that are not real,
For
right?
sure, yeah, hallucinates. I've seen it a lot. Yes.
So you definitely want to make sure that you double check it. I don't think, to be honest with you, that AI is at a point right now where you could just use it to write a grant for you. I think it would be a very poor grant.
Mm,
Um, so I don't suggest doing that. If it gets to the point where, it is competent enough to do that, I have a feeling that probably um, different foundations and the NIH and these types of things will use these programs that can detect AI written grants and will disqualify those
mm,
grants.
I
Um,
see.
so I think it's okay to use AI as a tool. I don't think it's
Mm,
okay to use AI to replace your part in writing the grant and in thinking and those types of things. So I think it's a great tool. You can use it to help things, be easier. You could use it to like make if you can say, okay, so we are, you can even type in, take the part where you've typed in the procedure that you want to do. You can
mhm,
put that into AI and you can say, can you make me a diagram that outlines, this what
mm.
we're planning to do here. And so sometimes
Mhm.
it can make you a nice figure for you to put into your grant or these types of things. I've never done that, but I have used AI to make other figures. So definitely, I think it could do that. But again, you want to double check it and make sure that it's accurate.
Well, it was interesting that there was a AI symposium at Stanford last year, and one talk was very interesting because they mentioned that they organized research labs that are run by AI bots. They propose research ideas, they write grants, they get funded, they do their research, and it's all with all AI. They organize the conference for themselves. They write abstracts to the conference. And I was curious how that conference went. I didn't check on it, but it supposedly happened last October. So no humans are involved at all. So there are AI reviewers, AI researchers doing their conference. So is that the world we will be living in? And what do you think about this?
I don't think so. I don't think so because I don't think AI actually thinks. Regardless
Okay.
of what everyone tells you, I don't think AI actually thinks, right? AI
Mhm.
uses the information that exists to give you its best answer of what it thinks the answer should be based on the information that exists, right?
Mhm.
But I think it's a different question when you're talking about trying to discover new things, right? True innovation. But AI is going to be super important, particularly for analyzing data when it comes
Mhm.
to big data sets, finding features in data that we as humans are
We don't see.
just, yeah, we don't see. There's just too much,
Mhm.
nuance there. So for sure, knowing how to use AI is going to be really important. But I don't think AI in and of itself is going to make humans obsolete. I think it's a tool like any other tool that can be used appropriately or can be used inappropriately, just like any other tool.
Yeah, awesome. That's a great answer. Thank you. Anybody else has any questions? How important is the preliminary data? So I'm just thinking about Ukrainians writing their grants and say they have not, it's their first one, right? They will not have preliminary data. Um, should I
Yeah,
be looking into grants that are, smaller in size and something feasibility pilot, something in that order?
Yeah, I think it depends again on the funding announcement. So some grants will require preliminary data, some don't, right?
Mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm,
if you don't have preliminary data, then you would want to go for a grant mechanism that doesn't require preliminary data. The other thing to keep in mind is that sometimes the preliminary data doesn't have to be yours.
Okay. Mhm.
So what I
That
mean by
helps.
that is particularly like for a clinical trial, let's say, right?
Right,
Let's
right.
say you want to
Hmm.
do clinical trial and there's preliminary data out there from trials other people have done.
Hmm.
Let's go back to this nicotine replacement. So there's data that, there's preliminary data that exists that patients who smoke do worse, right? So that's the preliminary data that you could include. It's okay if it's not yours, you just reference where it's from, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so it all depends. But for something like an RO1, yeah, absolutely, you have to have
You have to have it.
your preliminary data, and a good portion of it has to be your preliminary data.
Right.
Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, thank you so much. So there's a question, which areas of research in oncology in general require urgent investigation?
Um, that's good.
That's a
That's a
big
good question.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, so in terms of disease sites, obviously, the diseases that are doing the worst are GBMs,
yeah.
pancreatic cancer, triple negative breast cancer, sarcomas of the bone, like osteosarcomas, these types of things. These are the diseases where the patients are not do well at all. So I think those are probably the most urgent needs. In terms of like, mechanisms and these types of things, I think, for me, certainly understanding more the role that kind of diet and environment plays in helping us prevent cancer in the first place. Um, and as well as things like and these might be harder to get funded because I think they're a little bit more out there, but I think the field is slowly moving in that direction, is understanding like the role of stress on the immune system and how that affects
Mm-hmm.
cancer development, the response to treatment, uh,
Mm-hmm.
understanding inflammation, how the inflammation that we cause with radiation can be good or bad, um,
Mm-hmm.
depending on the context and these types of things. So, yeah.
I think it's very relevant for Ukrainians to give them ideas for their trials because their country is currently going through the war, right? So a lot of people live through constant stress, not
Mhm.
sleeping enough, worrying, right? So that might possibly produce more or like increase cancer rates, incidence, and worse mortality, morbidity. But it will take some time to test it, right? So that's a long project.
Yeah, and that the other problem is that stress can be difficult to quantify. Uh,
Correct. Yeah. Mhm.
to do those studies. But people have tried, they've tried looking at like cortisol levels or these types of things, or there's, different questionnaires that are out there that try to patient assessment questions that try to figure out the level of stress and kind of quantify it and these types of things. So there are tools that are out there. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, but um, yeah, I think there's those things. There's, what are the effects of kind of delay in treatment due to
Right.
what's going
Exactly.
on. So there's all kinds of questions that can be asked.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So that was a really amazing ending to our course, and the series was very interesting lecture full of great examples. And we are really appreciative of you sharing your trial. That was really amazing to see your R1 application and with all the details. Thank you. You explained it very well, and you talked about pitfalls and common mistakes. I think it will be very, very useful for our team here. Thank you again, and to everybody else, so thank you for participating in this course. And I'll be sending out the post-course exam, including some of the questions that Dr. Monjazeb prepared for us. So please answer those questions, and also there will be evaluation surveys helping us how to improve. I wish you good luck, and we will follow up with you with other webinars and the session from Ukrainians presenting their projects that they are doing in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure to be here and to be able to chat with you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Slava Ukraini!